I'm Taylor Sims, and I'm currently the Graduate Student Public Engagement and Professionalization Coordinator, which is just a fancy way to say I'm helping with career development right now among PhD students. So kind of the first question frames an introduction for you, which was, when did you finish your PhD at Michigan? And what are you up to these days?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, Taylor. It's great to be doing this, and hello to all of our grad student friends back in Ann Arbor or wherever you are right now. Miss everybody. Sending love and solidarity from Baltimore. So yeah, I'm Maximilian Alvarez. I got a dual PhD at the University of Michigan in history and comparative literature. And I have been living and working out here in the DC Baltimore area for the past couple years. So the question about when I finished my degree is, I guess, an interesting one, because technically I didn't finish it until recently, until this past summer. And I guess this will tie into kind of like what I've been doing after grad school. But a couple years ago, while I was still living in Ann Arbor, I ended up getting a job offer from the Chronicle of Higher Education to be an associate editor at the Chronicle Review, which is the ideas and opinions section at the Chronicle. And I'd written for the Chronicle before. I knew some of the editors, and was able to kind of successfully apply for an interview for that job. But when I took the job and left Ann Arbor, I was still technically a grad student. Um, and I guess this is perhaps advice for people. Juggling a full-time job and a dissertation, the podcast that I was doing, like, that wasn't great. So it was a very stressful year, or year and a half, I guess. So that was in 2018. And through 2018 and 2019, that's what I was doing. I was living here in Baltimore. I would go into DC to work at the Chronicle for like half the week, and then I could work from home the rest of the time. Then COVID-19 hit, and we all went into remote work. So yeah, like, since the pandemic started, for the first, I would say, 6 months of this nightmare, I was working from home, and every single free second that wasn't spent doing Chronicle work was spent working on my damn dissertation, which I really, really, really did not want to do. But I'd come that far. My family had pushed me that far, my friends, my loved ones. So I felt more than anything like I owed it to them to honor that sacrifice and to kind of finish what I started. But I do not begrudge anybody who does not make that decision. I think that's everyone's personal decision to make. There is no right way to make that decision. It's whatever's right for you. And so I decided that it was right for me to finish. But it sucked. It was one of the worst kind of periods of my life. Pandemic, work, dissertation. It was terrible. But I made it across the finish line, and finally defended this past July in 2019. So then, yeah, by September, I had gotten my degree, PhDs in history and comparative literature. And
Um,
I guess I've since I've already started explaining this, I also then, after that, left the Chronicle to take the current job that I have, which is the editor in chief role at the Real News Network here in Baltimore.
Well, congratulations on not only finishing the dissertation, no easy feat, and making the decision that was right for you, but also what sounds like a new gig. So,
Thank you.
double congratulations. Um, so, kind of moving on to the next question, thinking back to when you started the program, if you can remember, what motivated you to kind of apply for programs and enroll in a history PhD program?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is another kind of situation where, like, I'm happy to talk about my
Yeah, for sure.
experience. I guess I never know how relevant or useful it's going to be to other people, because, like, it was a bit of an unusual path, I suppose. Um, because I've talked about this kind of in my public work quite a bit. But I graduated from undergrad at the University of Chicago in 2009. And so, like many others, I got spat out into like the worst part of the recession. And things were very bad back home. And while I was trying to decide like if I wanted to go get a PhD, I was living back home and trying to kind of work and help out my family, but things just kept getting worse. And so, my dad was driving for Uber, my mom was working whatever job she could get. I was working like 12, 13-hour days as a temp worker in factories and warehouses for a while. And I was a waiter in Chicago. So there were a couple of years where I was out of the academy and doing kind of more crappy jobs like I had done for most of my life. And so that kind of, I think, really reframed the way that I approached the academy. And so when I finally did apply for PhD programs, it was for PhDs in comparative literature. I wanted to kind of bring together my previous degree, which were in Russian literature, and kind of infuse those with my interest in kind of studying my family history in Mexico, the kind of radical political history of 20th century Mexico, which had always fascinated me. And so that was kind of the general like hazy sort of project area that I entered the University of Michigan with, right? Was wanting to connect Russia,
Mm-hmm.
Mexico, the US through the left in the 20th century. There got to be some literary connections there, right? It could start with the obvious like Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo and Leon Trotsky and all the people who knew each other and were hanging out with each other. But then 2 years into that PhD program, I actually applied for a second PhD program in the history department. And I think I was very fortunate. My story, like I think a lot of our stories, is really a story of lucky encounters and kind of really miraculous kind of instances where I was fortunate enough to work with people who believed in me and encouraged me at exactly the right time. Right at U Chicago, that was Angelina Ilieva, who was a lecturer in the Slavic department, who really kind of supported me for a long time. At the University of Michigan, it was people like Howie Brick, who I love dearly, Jay Cook, Matt Lasseter, like I had taken classes by them. Um, and again, remember, having been out of the academy for a few years, I felt very out of my depth, and I felt very self-conscious about my lack of historical knowledge. And my first history course that I took was with kind of upper level graduate students, and frankly, they kind of made me feel like shit, for what I didn't know. Um, when I was never a history person, I was like, well, this isn't this why I'm taking the class, right? Is to learn. But I kind of buckled down. I read every page of every book that we were assigned. I marked up everything, as much as I could. And I really started to fall in love with history writing as such, right? All the stuff that we all get interested in at some point, right? What does it mean to write history? What are your sources? Whose voices are you listening to? How are you interpreting these stories? How are you placing them within the larger kind of discipline? What sorts of analytical frames are you using to understand, causality and so on and so forth? So as a literature person, I think I started to realize that the same type of, you know, analytical mechanics that made me love reading literature the way that I did, that I could use those in the same way if I studied history, right? In that kind of frame of mind. And it was people like Matt and Howie, who and Jay, who encouraged me to do that. And even they encouraged me to apply to the history PhD. And that was very meaningful to me. And so, yeah, the next year I enrolled in the history program, and so I had this kind of weird overlap um, of coursework and prelims work. So I had to do comparative literature prelims and history prelims in the same year, and that was not fun at all.
It's a chill down my spine when you said it.
Right. Well, idiot that I am, I thought that I could game the system, right, and put a lot of books that would overlap on my comp lit prelims. And so then my history advisors are like, oh great, so you've already read those, so here's some other ones that you should go read for your history prelims. So yeah, I guess I would say like the thing that like kind of brought me to wanting to actually apply to history and not just maybe take a couple courses, right, was that I I felt that the kind of questions that I wanted to study were as much historical as they were theoretical or literary, right? Because the kinds of questions I would ask of characters in novels, right? Or the kinds of questions that I would ask about language and meaning in literature. These were very much the kinds of questions that I found myself asking about how people kind of acted in different periods in history, right? What motivated them? How did they affect one another, right? How did they change the world that in turn changed them, right? Like how did they make meaning from, the kind of political activities that they were doing, from the stuff that they were reading, from the newspapers they were circulating, right? And so it was, again, it was people like Matt and Howie and Jay who I think encouraged me to just keep tugging at that thread and see kind of what happened. And so that's really what kind of motivated me to apply for the dual PhD program.
That's great. So you were 2 years into your comp lit program, you said, before you applied to history
Yes,
ish?
I think I applied in my second year and
Oh, okay.
I started the history PhD in my third year. So that was the year that I started it with comp lit prelims, and then I had to like stack my third year with history courses and then do history prelims at the end of
Wow.
that year.
That
Yeah.
sounds serious.
Yeah.
And also, like, your motivations changed while you were in your initial program and then started history. And then you kind of already explained how, towards the end of, the program and the dissertation writing, your motivations may have shifted. But from coursework through prelims and then early dissertation and then life, did you find that your motivations changed, over the course of your history program itself?
Like in terms of what I wanted my dissertation to be, or what I wanted my work to do, like, or I guess all of it, like.
I mean, whichever direction you want to go. I was kind of thinking in terms of how you wanted to use your PhD or where you saw it taking you, once you were done at Michigan. Because I know a lot of us, from the moment we decide to come to Michigan through the end, I mean, I know for myself, the idea of what my degree is going to do for me or with me, changes over the course of the program.
Yeah. So I think I don't come from, a family where like I'm the first in on either side of my family to get a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
So like I'm sure a lot of folks who see this will be able to relate, right? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
we didn't really have anything to compare it to. And so in our minds, it was like, this is what you do to become a professor, right?
Yeah.
There was a lot of that cultural cachet in our collective family hopes for what I would be able
Mm.
to do with the PhD. um and that's very much what I went into it wanting to become, right? Was an academic, like everybody else. I wanted to write books. I wanted to research and read and think, and I love teaching. I think
Mm-hmm.
the thing that I miss the most about academia is teaching. It was definitely the part of grad school that I enjoyed the most. It's where I felt the most intellectually alive. I think it's my favorite kind of arena to learn is in discussion with students and other kind of eager participants. Um, and so I wanted to do that. That seemed like a life worth living. That seemed like a dream worth having. Um, but I would say, in terms of how my motivations changed, it was more that in the earlier years, at a time when I still wanted to be a professional academic, after grad school, I still had this kind of deep gnawing sense that I didn't like the jargon, right? There was something about the elitism that really irked me, right? And that's not to say that I didn't love theory or kind of like the high academic debates. I did. But the more enclosed they felt, the more like elitist they felt, the less I was able to kind of sit comfortably with that, especially when I would try to explain to my family and my friends what it actually was that I was doing, right? And as far as I was concerned, like if I can't make this knowledge usable, then what good is it, right? If my family sacrificed so much to get me here just so I could turn around and say, well, you wouldn't understand it, like, why is that worth pursuing? It didn't seem worth all the work and sacrifice, right? And so, I think that even from kind of the early years of my PhD, and I think this was also very much influenced by the jobs that I'd had before graduate school, right? The recession had changed quite a bit for me. I grew up a very conservative Catholic person in Southern California, um and yeah, we lost everything in the recession, and I was working alongside a lot of people at the warehouses and factories, and we would get into conversations about really important stuff, like it would be kind of in a jokey way over a cigarette or something like that, but it just was a constant reminder, like the reminders I would get when I would talk to my family or friends. It's just like no one is stupid, like everyone is capable of, and in some ways interested in the kinds of things that academics study, right? It's not that you know that we need to try to convince them that these things are important, right? It's more that we need to put our research and knowledge in conversation with the knowledge and interests of other people who aren't in academia. And that was always a really important thing for me. It was always important for me that I could try to communicate to my friends and my family what it was I was working on. And when I couldn't, I felt I took that failure very much to heart. And so I would say, even though I still wanted to be a professor, I did put a premium on, like I said, teaching. That was a way that I could work out how to talk about my work in a way that was accessible for people who weren't specialists in it, how to open that work up in a way that would allow other people to inform it with their ideas and their thoughts and their debates. And then I would, do a lot of writing. I started doing a lot of public writing, especially around the 2016 election, because a lot of the stuff that I was teaching, I taught this popular course called Welcome to the Monkey House: How Politics Becomes a Reality Show,
Hmm.
where we were looking at media theory, literature, and the 2016 election as it was unfolding, and trying to kind of use the tools of literary analysis to actually explain what the hell was happening. Um, and so, it was in doing that kind of writing that I felt I was able to I was able to kind of satisfy that need that I had to make my work usable beyond an academic context. If I didn't have that, I don't think I would have been able to continue with, you know, the dissertation work and all the other and the journal articles that I was writing. For me, it was okay to juggle them at the same time. I saw the value in each one. They didn't have to be the same thing, but I definitely wanted there to be kind of serious connective tissue there. Um, and I would say the change in my motivation, which ultimately led me to the career where I am, was when I started to kind of see the public writing and public scholarship and public speaking, as perhaps the final form of all the work that everything I've been working up to, right? Everything that I've been researching, right? I still finished the dissertation. I'm still very proud of the dissertation. I think there's some value in it. I wouldn't recommend reading all of it, but there are parts of it that I think are okay. Um, but in a lot of ways, doing that work, I think really, it's been very gratifying to think that like I'm actually fortunate enough to be in a position where I feel like I'm using a lot of stuff that I wrote about and read about and studied, but in a more practical way, right? I studied left media in 20th century Mexico, and now I am making left media in 21st century America, right? And I'm trying to bring one to bear on the other. So that's, I would say, the main, it was a very long-winded way of answering your question, but that's the main, I think, change in motivation, right? Was that I always needed to make the work publicly accessible and usable in some context. Um, but I always, earlier on, I felt like that was just kind of a side hustle, right? Something that I was doing more for me and for the people I loved who weren't academics. But in the end, that ended up kind of being the main driving force for what I was doing.
Thank you. I think that's really important and meaningful, and really informs like where you are now. So the next question is related, but the what do you wish you had learned in graduate school? And then the kind of sub point to that question was anything specifically in terms of career development or sometimes what we call professionalization.
Yes.
I bet.
So yeah, for anyone who's been watching this, you know, take from the first 30 minutes what you will, but this is what I imagine may be a little more useful.
Mhm.
But you know, because I get this question a lot, especially from people who, you know, they've seen my writing, they've
Mhm.
seen, you know, the interviews that I've done and stuff like that. And so, you know, understandably, this is what I did, right? When I wanted to get published, I started reaching out to writers whose work I admired, right? And trying to build a relationship with them, trying to show them that I wasn't just networking, right? I genuinely loved their work. It was work that I thought was similar to mine. And so I thought, if they were willing, if they had time, which a lot of people don't, but it's always worth trying and
Mhm.
asking politely. But I thought if they had time, that they might be able to give me some pointers on how to publish the kind of writing that I was doing. And I would say more often than not, I got a good response. You know, it's just like academics, right? If you spend your whole life working on this stuff and writing about this stuff, and then when someone who really wants to engage with it emails you, if you don't want to talk to that person, then what the hell good are you, right? What was all that studying for, right? So that's what I tell people when they say like, oh, I'm worried about reaching out to this person, what if they say no? And I'm like, then screw them, right? You know, then they're not people you want to take advice from anyway, right? Anyway, sorry, that was a little tangent, but you
Still good
know,
advice.
so I would say that right. So you know, I was like I said, the writing that I was doing was very much kind of a side hustle for quite a few years while I was at Michigan. And you know, my advisors, you know, they always kind of told me the same thing. They were like, "That's fine, just don't let it impact your dissertation work. The dissertation comes first, right?" Um, but I, you know, and I thank my advisors for that. You know, I thank them for not kind of putting more pressure on me to stop. I definitely felt that pressure from other people, from other scholars, from even administrators, right? Because if an article would stir up, you know, a ruckus, right, or cause like a political backlash, right, or if I was making an argument about higher education that I knew some people wouldn't like, you know, I would get the kind of, you know, concerned tones in the hallway saying, oh, you better be careful, like, you know, when you're on the job market, people might not like that, yada yada yada. So there was, I guess, where I'm going with this is that there are a lot of pressures on you as a graduate student if you want to do more public scholarship. These pressures are being applied by people who largely don't know what they're talking about. And believe me when I say that, because most academics, professional academics, can't write for crap, right? And I know that because I would get their pitches, right? I would edit their stuff at the Chronicle. That's not a knock on them. That's just saying have some humility before you dole out your advice, right? And so, you know, the advice that I would get about, you know, making sure the dissertation was first, not rocking the boat too much, don't devote too much time to this public engagement, because when you apply for academic jobs, no one's going to care about it. You know, if you don't have journal articles along with these kind of public articles, it's actually going to hurt you, right? That kind of thing. Um, you know, the academic job market is not doing, I mean, look at the state of the academic job market. right? You know, like anyone who tells you like they can give you a recipe for succeeding in such a horrible job market that's been blown up not only by kind of decades of neoliberal mismanagement, but also the COVID-19 pandemic. Anyone who's trying to kind of coach you on how to navigate that is full of crap, right? I mean, right? It's a lottery, you know, right now. It really is a crapshoot. And it was a crapshoot even when I was on it, right? And the worst thing that you can do is try to kind of take the nature of that crapshoot and sort of internalize it as like something that you can control entirely. You can't. And you shouldn't blame yourself if you don't get the results that you want, because it's not your fault that you are playing in a game that has so few winners, right? You know, this is something I had to tell my dad when we lost everything 10 years ago, right? It was very, very hard for him to understand that a global recession was not his fault. Um, but eventually, you know, he understood. So let me kind of make this a little more concrete. What
Mhm.
I wish I had known going into graduate school is that your time as a grad student is some of the most valuable time that you're ever going to have in your life, in not only your academic life, but your writing life, your social life, your thinking life. You're most likely never going to have a chance to read as much as you can. You're not going to get paid a whole lot, but you're getting paid, you know, hopefully enough to be able to focus on that. Even if you get a tenured professorship, you're not going to have that time, right? You're going to be juggling a billion other things, and you're going to have to hope that you get some grant or a sabbatical to be able to kind of enjoy what you currently have the ability to do now in graduate school. I think the worst part about how we coach graduate students is that we convince them to waste what is the most valuable and productive time that they have as academics, focusing on this kind of future that doesn't exist, right? Or may not exist, or most likely will not exist, right? And so you end up looking backwards and you say, man, I wasted like that time doing more and more stuff for a dissertation that 5 people are ever going to read, and I didn't write that article that I wanted to. I didn't go on that panel I wanted to. I didn't organize that teach-in that I thought was important. My advice is do it. Use that time. Use the kind of atmosphere that you have when you are around other smart, interesting people who are just as passionate as you are about something, right? You know, that's when you get out of graduate school, that's very hard to find. And I would say use it to the best of your abilities. um you know, use the power that you have as a graduate student. I think that's another thing, is a lot of times we convince ourselves that as grad students we're the lowest kind of on the totem pole. We don't have any kind of institutional power, and that's because they're dangling the kind of promise of a secure future over your head, right? But if you kind of put that out of your mind, you say, well, that future is kind of up in the air anyways, so I might as well make the most of my time here. That gives you a lot of freedom, right? You know, you're gonna have to kind of hit certain benchmarks and do certain work for your dissertation to make sure that, you know, you don't get your funding cut or anything like that. Like, I'm not telling you just throw your dissertation away, but I'm saying there's a ton of time there that you can use and you should use, right, to do what you want to do. And if like professors are telling you don't write these articles, don't listen to them. They don't know what they're talking about, right? Or, you know, or go talk to someone who does know what they're talking about, right? You know, just don't let that kind of cultural pressure that academia is so good at applying on all of us, right? That pressure that tells you that you just got to put your head down because the reward is somewhere off in the future. Don't let that pressure kind of keep you from doing work that you find meaningful, work that you think is politically necessary, um, even if it's not kind of the work that you're doing on your dissertation.
I think that's right on and great advice, especially good to hear in this moment where we feel so disconnected from our communities, that they're still there, you know, and still active, even if they feel so distant and always through a computer screen. Um,
Right. Well, that's
so
another
with,
thing. The
yeah,
sorry, the productivity cult.
go
I
ahead.
was actually I was writing a piece for the Chronicle before I ended up getting this job at the Real News. So unfortunately, I had to let it drop. but it was on the kind of like, what good is this cult of productivity in the middle of a pandemic? Like, I had had so many people writing into me, and I really wanted to kind of share their kind of quotes, right? But people who were just like, still, with all of the kind of emotional burden, with family members who were sick, with themselves getting sick, if they had kids, like, there's just so much going on in our lives right now, and so much going on in the world, and still that culture is deeply lodged in our brains. Like I said, I was victim to it too, or guilty of it too. I wanted to just say, screw it, I don't want to do this dissertation, I just want to focus on my family, I want to like focus on my mental health. But there was some gnawing thing in the back of my head that was just like, you're going to be a failure if you don't do this, right? You have to be productive, you have to meet this deadline. um that's who is that serving? Why is it for? Like, what? Like, why who are you being productive for? Right? Like, what future is that productivity directed towards? Right? Like, no one knows what is going to happen in the future, so stop acting like you're so certain that you do. Right? Make the most of the moment that you have. If people are telling you, that they know better what you should be doing with your time amidst all this, run the other way. Don't trust them. They don't have your best interests in mind.
Yeah, I especially appreciate that idea of like leveraging the uncertainty a different way. Like instead of letting it totally crush you, think of, the freedom it gives you. Instead of, if I check all these boxes, then blank will happen. So I don't want to keep you longer than promised. So we have about 5 minutes left. Um, so our last few questions were about the role of public engagement in your work, which I feel like is stunningly obvious with what you do. How COVID-19 has impacted your work and how you've adapted, or just how you're doing more generally. And then finally, it was that kind of wide open, anything else you want to convey to graduate students. So I'll kind of leave it to you to pull from that grab bag so that I kind of keep us to our promised time.
Sure. So, remind me the COVID-19 question again. Sorry.
Yeah, of course. It was, how has COVID-19, the pandemic in general, impacted your work over, when I originally wrote these questions, it was these past few months, this past year. And then how are you adapting? How are you doing?
Well, it's funny because I guess, like, in a way, the work that I had done in graduate school kind of prepared me to make the most of this time. Right? I mean, to start off, I'm doing terribly. Everyone's doing terribly, right?
Feel
Like,
that.
my
Yeah.
my body's falling apart, my knees are clicking. I like, and I'm like, I'm not doing anything, right? I'm just sitting at my damn desk every day. But that's probably why. But, like, yeah, I mean, like, none of us are sleeping well. Like, we 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 need each other, right? We need to be near each other. We need to, as human beings, we need one another to be who we are, to live. So much so that if you take that away from us, we actually physically start falling apart, right? And so, I think it's for anyone in academia who is not feeling okay right now, that's okay. That's normal. That's fine. We here outside of academia aren't feeling too hot either, right? And again, don't listen to anybody who is trying to tell you otherwise. Um, but I think that after going through the kind of just horror of finishing the PhD while doing my job at the Chronicle and being on lockdown for the pandemic. I mean, I'm grateful and that I'm fortunate enough to be able to work from home.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, it was bad. Like, while I was trying to finish the dissertation, I was just hopped up on 5-hour energies. I was sleeping like 3 hours a night. I was having like nightmares. I'd wake up in cold sweats. There would be times where I'd be so tired and I wanted nothing more than to just sleep, but my brain couldn't shut off. And I would literally be in bed crying because I just wanted to go to bed and I couldn't.
Hmm.
And I hated academia for that. I hated Michigan for that. I hated that I felt over 8 years, I had already earned my PhD. After all I had done, I had earned that PhD. The finishing this dissertation was the formality. And I resented the fact that I had to kind of put myself under this kind of strain, and the strain that it caused all my loved ones, um, to get that piece of paper, right? And I still feel that way. Don't get me wrong. Again, I'm glad I pushed myself, and I'm proud of what I produced. But if you ask me, like, well, if you could have gotten the paper, without finishing that last chapter, would you have? I said, yeah, hell yeah, I would have. Who's that going to benefit? Right? I'm not going to publish that thing. So it's been tough, but after that experience, it caused me to kind of think about setting boundaries, and really kind of trying to make the time for myself that I wasn't making before. And that looks different for everybody. That looks different for everybody, right? And this is what I meant when I said the work that I was doing back at Michigan kind of prepared me for this, because you know the writing that I would do, that became an important emotional outlet for me, an intellectual outlet. It was a way to feel engaged with the world outside of my own head, right? Outside of my own sphere, right? To engage with the work of others that I thought was really interesting, to talk with people who, I wanted to talk to, right? I started this show, Working People, my podcast.
Hmm.
So I started that podcast back at Michigan, right? And it doesn't work now because people are working remotely, but I guess another layer to add to the whole use the tools that grad school gives you to the best of your ability is that I actually started the podcast using equipment that I would check out from like LSNA, or not LSNA, but
Hmm.
like the MLB. Um, so I would go get a mic, I would get like a little recorder, and that was how I started recording the first interviews with workers for my show, Working People. And then eventually I was able to upgrade, right? But those conversations have really been a lifesaver over the years, right? Because they give me a chance to sit down and talk to working people about their lives and their jobs and dreams and struggles, and provide a listening ear, right? I don't feel like a voyeur. I'm not trying to kind of like steal their stories. The whole premise of the show is that like I'm here to be a listening ear and an eager discussant with people who never get the chance to have their stories told this way, right? And it's always, I think, very soul renewing for me. And so, that's been really helping me, is like at when I feel just so exhausted from all the Zoom meetings and all the other work, just having those types of conversations is really helpful. It really centers me. It really kind of puts me back on that kind of firm terrain that reminds me what I'm fighting for, right? It reminds me that yeah, the dignity of humanity, right, is the thing that I want to spend my life fighting to honor, right? And however I can, right? And I think that you don't have to be recording for a podcast and publishing it to have that, right? You could have that, you could have a group of friends where, you guys spend 1 hour a week just chatting, right? Or you do kind of a collective project together. You make something and then you mail it to the next person and they add to it, right? I mean, like we have to get more creative these days.
Hmm.
But I think that the real takeaway point is that just like that kind of constant productivity cult in academia, right? That is a capitalist like way of thinking, right? That is productivity at the expense of humanity, right? And that is kind of the rule across the globe, and academia is no different, right? And so I guess what I would say is that if we are left to the devices of the market, right? If we let ourselves be pushed the way that this society wants us to push us, we're going to be even more miserable and disconnected and disaffected, um, because that's what the system does to us. And so you have to fight against that, right? You have to kind of push against it and say like, no, I'm going to make time for something that is unproductive, right? I'm going to make time for friends, and I'm going to tell myself that that time is just as valuable as time spent on working on my dissertation. Like, don't listen to people who tell you it's not. um I didn't like, that's easier said than done. Like, it took me going through all that and being out of academia to realize it. I didn't think that way. I couldn't convince myself of that 3 years ago when I was in Ann Arbor. No matter how much other people tried to get me to, I was still very much a product of that cult like mentality, and I wish I wasn't. For all the things that I'm glad that I did in graduate school, I still could not, as from doing a second PhD to all the writing to like the journal articles and the dissertation, right? I always thought that being more productive would justify the pain that I was putting myself through, and it didn't, right? And I lost a lot of cherished precious moments in the process. So I would just say, don't let that kind of pressure push you in a direction that is not good for you. Take the time that you can to do the things that renew you.
The other questions were about how you see the role of public engagement in your current work, which again, I think is kind of obvious, but if you want to comment on it, please do. And then finally, it was if there was anything else, that I didn't include in the questions that you wanted to pass along to current graduate students.
Yeah. So like you said, yeah, the public engagement thing, I suppose, is pretty obvious. Now that I guess what I would amend from my previous answer, right? Because there's a weird dynamic here, right? That I want to be very transparent about,
Mm-hmm.
because at the same, like, having gone through the graduate programs in Michigan, right? Like I said, I saw and experienced so many people kind of tell me, don't focus on this stuff, it's going to hurt your career, right? Or this isn't serious scholarship, right? Or yada yada yada, right? Now that I had a job at the Chronicle,
Mm-hmm.
that I'm the editor-in-chief of the Real News, like I just had an interview with Cornell West and Trisha Rose, and so people come out of the woodwork, right? The same people who told you don't do this are now asking you to help them get published, right? The same people are coming to you, and kind of, they've forgotten, that they had told you so recently that this was all a bad idea, right? Or worse, they hold you up or hold me up, right, as an example of how alt-ac stuff is where people should be focusing, right? That's another bullshit argument. Or sorry, is that, can I swear?
Fine.
that's, that's another bullshit
I asked
argument.
for honesty, so.
All right. This is the same, it's the same logic that politicians use when they say, like, oh, we need fewer people going to universities and more people going to trade schools. It's like, you don't actually know what goes on in trade schools. Like, yeah, trade schools serve an important function, but for you, they're just this rhetorical widget to make your point about why four-year universities are bad, right? There's kind of a similar thing going on here, right? Where I kind of regret or resent that the professors and administrators, save a few kind of exceptions, who didn't think that this was kind of like a serious path for me, and who kind of tried to discourage me from doing this, are now trying to kind of tell graduate students at the University of Michigan and beyond, who are facing just a job market that has been blown up, right? A future for academia that is very much uncertain, right? A future for all of us that is very much uncertain, right? They see that, and they have the gall to tell you all, right, that, like, well, look at Max, he made it work, you should go into alt-ac. Like, journalism's not doing any better, right? I mean, like, there were tons of layoffs in journalism this year at the Real
Mm-hmm.
News. I took the job in November, or in October. A month and a half later, we got a massive budget cut and lost half of our staff. Like, that sucked. Like, I that wasn't what I signed up for. Like, I thought I signed up to work with all of these people at the Real News, and before I could even really get my feet wet, like, we got this bomb thrown on us. We're still standing and we're rebuilding, and I'm grateful for that. A lot of other outlets can't say that. But this is what I mean when I say, like, a lot of academics don't know what the hell they're talking about when they try to kind of, present like their advice as really the expert advice on
Mm-hmm.
they try to present themselves as experts on stuff they don't know anything about, right? There are still jobs in journalism and media making. There are exciting opportunities. There's also a lot of competition, right? And so, the thing that I would say about that is that I find it really disingenuous, and it really pisses me off when you have late stage graduate students, maybe in their sixth, seventh, or eighth year, who are not having success on the job market, which again is most of us. The vast majority of us do not have success on the job market. It is the norm, not the exception. So advisors who have nothing left to say will say like, oh, well, you should maybe look for journalism jobs. Again, academia does not teach you how to write well for the public. It doesn't teach you how to engage well, in non-academic conference settings, right? That's a skill that you have to develop. It's not something that you can just jump into at the end of your PhD program. Trust me, you can't. Your academia, your academicness is gonna show, right? And so I say all that because if you want to get into journalism or media, again, you should start early. Like, use the time that you have. Read as much as you can, like we love to do in grad school. Read people whose work you find fascinating. Read publications, there's so many out there. Listen to a bunch of podcasts, right? Consume and really try to find where you would want your voice to kind of participate in that ecosystem. Sharpen your craft, right? Engage in debates, build relationships with writers and editors, right? That's kind of a while I was juggling my academic work and my public scholarship, I was actually doing a lot of the things that would end up benefiting me when I applied eventually for the job at the Chronicle 2 years ago, right? I was making those connections, but I wasn't thinking about it as like, I'm doing this to build a career, right? It was just, I want to get published. I want to respond to this debate. I feel like I have something important to say. So I want to reach out to this editor at this magazine, right? But those things end up kind of being really important in the long run. They're also not things that you can just pretend to have at the end of your 8th year in graduate school if you haven't been doing this at all before, right? And again, don't listen to anyone who tells you that you can, right? It's just like, we professors and administrators do this in so many ways. They'll say, oh, well, you can go teach K through 12. It's like they do a very different thing than we do. It's also a very highly developed skill that you need training for that we don't get that training for, right? There's just this kind of ridiculous conceit that if you go through grad school, that will kind of make you qualified for so many things that you're not qualified for. That's not to say there's no hope. It's just to say don't dupe yourself into believing that's true. If this is a path that you want to explore moving forward, reach out to people who can give you good advice about it, who can tell you about what they did. A lot of them will tell you, like me, a lot of it is luck, just like the academic job market. Um, and then, yeah, like I would say, just use the time that you have in grad school to start building up a portfolio, start building up a name for yourself, build up your social media profile. There's a lot of things you can do piecemeal, but public engagement has become like a buzzword, but it's really just another category for people's CVs as far as like kind of academic advisors are concerned. And if you approach it that way, I think not only are you going to be bad at it, but it's also just not going to be something that you want to commit your life to, right? If you do take public engagement seriously, like I do, right? I think that you have to see it as more than that. See it as more than just a byline at a magazine that you can kind of parade around to your friends, right? Because sorry, you got me, like, now a whole bunch of things are coming up, because another way that ends up screwing you over is that if you're just focused on getting the byline for public publications, that leads a lot of academics to write for publications that don't pay anything. And if you're writing for free, you're a scab, right? And you are depressing like freelance wages for everyone out there who is trying to make a living through their writing. Don't be a scab. Don't write for places that can't pay. Occasionally, if it's like a smaller publication that you really believe in, sure, write a piece for them. But don't make it a habit just because you're trying to get articles for public consumption on your CV to make you seem like a public scholar. You're not a public scholar if you publish 3 op-eds that no one reads, right? It's got to be more than that. It's got to actually take the engagement part of public engagement seriously. You're not coming down from the mount to sermonize to a beleaguered, public that is just like waiting agape for you to bless them with their knowledge. That's not the case, right? You have to make your work usable. You have to do the work to make it stick and to see what people care about, and to make your work matter in those contexts. That's a skill that you develop, and it's not one you can develop right off the bat.
Well, thank you. I think that's really important, especially thinking about the implications, ethical implications about public engagement. Is it all right if I kind of ask you a question on the fly that
Sure.
wasn't? Um, so, as we as a department kind of try to bake in some of the things that it sounds like we're really lacking, like a lot of the success you've had with your public engagement was, despite what was going on in the program, not because of. Um, and there are efforts right now to try to bake that into coursework or change some of the coursework so that students are more equipped or don't feel like they have to like hide this other work they're doing while they do their serious academic work. Again, this is on the fly, so it's not fully formulated, but do you think that helps or hurts, like this public engagement effort, like by absorbing it into this traditional curriculum, is it hurting it or is it helping? If that question makes any sense. And I'm genuinely curious, not just asking, as someone who represents the department in many ways.
No, I think it makes tons of sense. I think it's a fantastic question. Because yeah, it I didn't put this as articulately as I wanted to before, but like that was always the really funny thing to me, right? Is that because I remember being a grad student at Michigan, when people would come to me say, "Hey, I want to get this published. Could you help me?" And they would be very secretive about it because they'd be like, should I use a
Mm-hmm.
separate name in case my advisor sees it? Because they told me not to write this stuff. They told me
Wow.
that if you focus on this stuff, like I said, it was one of two things. It was either A, um, this isn't serious work. You should be focusing on your dissertation. That's what's going to get you a job. Or it was B, this is going to kind of like come back to bite you in the ass, like when you're applying for a job. Because it's either the people on the search committee are going to see it as like a waste of time, or you're going to say something politically that may hurt you, yada yada yada. What I would always tell them, I was like, well, they say that now, but once you get big, they're going to be coming to you asking
Mm-hmm.
for advice, which is exactly what happened to me, right? Like I did a lot of the writing in the beginning in secret because I had heard other people's like horror stories of having like the public engagement stuff squashed out of them. And then when I started getting kind of asked to go on radio shows and panels and stuff like that, then suddenly it was okay, right? As long as I could bring positive attention back to the university and to like comp lit or history, then it was okay. But it was like getting from A to B, that was kind of like the problem area, right? And so I do think it is a positive development that the history department is kind of trying to bake this into the curriculum and give graduate students more of the tools that they need to develop those skills that I was talking about. Because like first, more than anything, I'm just glad to hear it because the very fact of building that into the curriculum means that it is recognized as a skill to be developed,
Right.
right? Because I think the biggest problem, like I said before, that I had is that bullshit academic conceit that we could just do this if we wanted to,
Right.
um when we can't, right? When it actually is hard, right? It actually, to not only in general to write well and to write in a way that is, again, engaging. What does that mean? It means that people are going to want to read past the first paragraph, right? Which is very hard to do in these times. People aren't reading as much, right? Now, like I said, I run a media company. I run the editorial side of the Real News, and we can see like how long people spend on an article. And like we're not doing the creepy thing where you track their eyes and stuff, but you can see if someone scrolls to the bottom of an article, a lot of times they don't, right? I mean, so you have to work hard to keep that engagement alive, especially when we're all so imbricated in a super saturated media ecology that turns our attention spans to nothing, right? You got to work that much harder to develop the skill of engaging people and doing so in a way that is, I think, meaningful and doesn't sacrifice kind of the real goal that you're trying to achieve with whatever it is you're producing, writing, podcasting, yada yada yada, right? I myself have had to learn that a lot, right? If you look at my old articles, I they were like 4,000 words a piece, right? That wouldn't fly today. I think people seem to read them more around 2016, but I would never do that now. I just don't think people have that kind of patience, and it would be very elitist of me to say, well, you should read it. I'm not going to like shorten my work for you, right? That just doesn't make any sense. And so yeah, I really appreciate that it is being recognized for the skill that it is. I think that there's a lot more to add to that, right? Because like I said, it's not just what you do on your side. It's not just the writing or speechifying, right? Or podcasting, right? It's about the engagement. It's about the connection that you make with the people you were trying to connect with, right? That's a much harder thing to study, but it's also like it's just as important as developing kind of the skills to be a public writer or speaker or podcaster or what have you, right? And I guess it's an open question about what the best way would be to approach that. I think there are some great success stories, right? There are great history podcasts that are run by like student groups through the history departments at colleges around the country that have been very successful, right? And that have built up an audience that feeds back kind of impressions and information and gives them leads and tips, that it becomes more of an engaging collaborative project and not just kind of a top down sort of what's the word I'm looking for, not a top down like sermonizing elitist kind of exercise in intellectual masturbation or anything like that. Another success story is a buddy of mine, Zachary Davis at Harvard, was working with a lot of folks at the Harvard Divinity School to produce a podcast called The Ministry of Ideas. It was a great podcast. I loved it. And then they kind of spun that into a whole new venture where they are trying to take the kind of collective knowledge of so many academics who will never get a tenured job and basically give them the ability through podcasts to teach specialized courses where they can get direct feedback from students and stuff like that. So that project is called Lyceum, I believe, but it's taking as seriously what we're producing, the show that we're making, and kind of the information that we're putting there, and the engagement, right, that we're trying to instill, right, the kind of the meaning that we're trying to make this have in other people's lives. That's a much thornier kind of question, but I think that there are a lot of kind of interesting and creative ways that you can approach it. So I guess my half answer would be that I think that sounds great. I would just caution thinking about the development of that skill as just something uh, that exists within you, right? If you're going to engage with the public, you need to engage with the public, right? You need to know what that public is, right? Or who that public is, or whether or not there is a big thing called the public, right? So like, which communities do you want to serve? How do you want to serve them? Are you listening to them when they tell you what they need, right? Are you producing something that they want or they can use, right? I think but that's exciting, right? I mean, it opens up a lot of doors for exploratory work that if the history department is giving graduate students a way to use their time and their limited stipends, to focus on that kind of work and that kind of outreach, and not kind of suppress it or make us feel like we're doing something bad or naughty or whatever. That's a good thing.
Great. Well, thank you. Sorry to add a question that was not ahead of time as promised, but I really appreciate your thoughtful answer. Again, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure other graduate students will as well.
Thanks so much for having me. Bye, everybody.